Greetings, friends. We're going to read from this book again today, Wealth and Democracy, A Political History of the American Rich, but it's actually the Dutch Republic, or the United Provinces of the Netherlands, that we're going to be reading about the rise and fall of their golden age in the 17th century. So previously we read about the rise and fall of Spain, the Spanish golden age. This book also talks about the rise and fall of Britain, and ultimately to put into context what's happening in the United States today. By the way, this book is written by Kevin Phillips. So when they refer to the Dutch Republic, they often say the United Provinces. The emergence of the United Provinces was hugely helped by aid from the Protestant powers of Northern Europe. It also profited from three 16th and 17th century streams of refugees whose memberships had high ratios of commercial skills. Some 150,000 Protestant Flemings fleeing Antwerp, Bruges, and Ghent after 1585 doubled Amsterdam in size and turned it into Europe's new commercial capital. 10,000 Sephardic and German Jews, some of them bankers and merchants, brought family and religious networks, and 15,000 to 20,000 Huguenots fleeing the France of Louis XIV came later with other talents and connections. The United Provinces of the Netherlands, born of a late 16th century revolt against Habsburg authority, started their own extraordinary climb to commercial leadership while Spain's might was still in place. The engines of Dutch advance were maritime, commercial, and even religious. The expulsion of Protestants in 1585 from the Spanish Netherlands, which was later Belgium, sent so many bankers, merchants, and artisans fleeing to the Protestant north that, in the words of one refugee, Antwerp became Amsterdam, mushrooming from 30,000 residents in 1580 to 105,000 in 1622 and 201,000 by 1662. Amsterdam replaced Antwerp as Europe's commercial capital. Frugal and commercially adept, the Dutch, only 1 million or so in contrast to 16 million Frenchmen and 20 million Spaniards, soon boasted the world's largest merchant fleet, some 6,000 ships in 1669, virtually as many as the rest of Europe, as well as its largest pool of investment capital. The Dutch also developed Europe's most advanced technology, and through it, large and successful textile, shipbuilding, fishing, and specialized industries. In the 1600s, Dutch shipping jumped from regional importance to lucrative control of the so-called rich trades to the Baltic, the Levant, and the Indies, an edge they held for another 100 years. By the 1700s, although Amsterdam remained Europe's great lending center, the Dutch elite had begun to shift their own investments to the next great economic power, Britain. The golden age of the United Provinces came between 1647, when Dutch ships were readmitted to seaports under the Spanish crown, and the French invasion of 1672. Some historians have stretched it further, from the 1630s up to 1702 and the economic disruptions of the War of the Spanish Succession. Dutch commercial success in the first half of the 17th century was middle class and relatively unpretentious. This cultural conservatism is still apparent in the cautious, calculating faces painted by Rembrandt or Hals and the sober facades of their great houses on Amsterdam's Herengracht. If thrifty Holland had Europe's first industrial proletariat, it was a relatively well-paid one. Wages were 2 or 3 times higher than in Switzerland or nearby Germany. Dutch municipal neatness and sanitation was the wonderment of visitors. Commercial centers like Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Delft, and Zaandam doubled and trebled their population in the first half of the 17th century, even while Castilian towns far to the south were shrinking by almost the same ratios. Yet the Dutch prosperity and wealth that most impressed foreign observers was that of the brede middenstand, the broad middle of the population whose ratios were unmatched elsewhere in Europe. In the words of one historian, the Republic was an island of plenty in an ocean of want. Its artisans, even its unskilled workers, and its farmers, for it seems a misnomer to call them peasants, enjoyed higher real incomes, better diets, and safer livelihoods than anywhere else on the continent. Retrospection on the Dutch Republic's 18th century ebb has matched historians over absolute versus relative decline, with an edge to the former. Output in the major Dutch textile center of Leiden started slipping in the 1670s. One index of Dutch industrial production showed a peak in 1667. Workers' wages stagnated after 1671, although purchasing power sometimes improved because of declining food prices. Finance began to displace hands-on commerce. As early as the 1650s, traders in Amsterdam had complained that the ruling burgomasters and regents, once themselves in trade, now derived their income from houses, land, and money at interest. Such observations only grew. By 1688, the English consul in Amsterdam, William Carr, observed that the old severe and frugal way of living is now almost quite out of date in Holland. There is very little to be seen of that sober modesty in apparel, diet, and habitations as formerly. Instead of convenient dwellings, the Hollanders now build stately palaces, have their delightful gardens and houses of pleasure. Nevertheless, the grave and sober people of Holland are very sensible of the great alteration. Changes in the Dutch economy were deepened by two great military conflicts, the 9 Years' War from 1688 to 1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1713. Jonathan Israel, in his magisterial 1995 volume, The Dutch Republic, Its Rise, Greatness, and Fall, 1477 to 1806, employed the later Golden Age, 1647 to 1702, as a chapter title, but asserted separately that the permanent, irreversible decline of Holland as a maritime and industrial power commenced only in or around 1688, with the onset of the 9 Years' War and its many harmful consequences for the Dutch economy. The continuation of war in 1702 to 1713 strained Dutch maritime strength and credit to the breaking point. The navy, which under Tromp de Ruyter had outsailed England's, was broken. Trade with the Mediterranean and Levant ebbed. Dutch interest rates were forced up to 9% in 1709 versus 6% for Britain, and by 1713 the Republic's national debt had tripled over 1688's. This pushed high taxes steadily higher, even as other European nations felt free to raise protective walls against Dutch textiles. Shipbuilding joined fisheries in the doldrums, and the Zaandam industrial district, Europe's most intensive, peaked in the 1720s and then declined in the face of growing protectionism elsewhere on the continent. Dutch mechanical skills continued to lead the world, and Amsterdam's entrepot kept a number of high value-added industries, tobacco processing, sugar refining, sail canvas, silk, and linen, prosperous through the 1740s. By the 1750s, however, the plight of large sections of the United Provinces was beyond denial. James Boswell's notes from a 1764 visit are often cited. Most of their principal towns are sadly decayed, and instead of finding every mortal employed, you meet with multitudes of poor creatures who are starving in idleness. Utrecht is remarkably ruined. There are whole lanes of wretches who have no other subsistence than potatoes, gin, and stuff which they call tea and coffee. Towns that had grown with industry now hemorrhaged. Leiden's population fell from 70,000 in 1688 to 60,000 in 1732 and 36,000 in 1749. Haarlem's population from 50,000 to 40,000 and then 26,000. Zaandam dropped from 20,000 in 1688 to 12,000 in 1749. Three of the urban centers that were still expanding exemplified the periwig age. Amsterdam managed the money, The Hague grandly housed much of the diplomatic corps and nobility, and Schiedam distinguished itself, if that is the word, as the principal Dutch manufactory of gin, the new craving of the masses. Visitors found it hard to remember that this same nation a century earlier had bustled with middle-class prosperity. Food and tax riots were common in the disillusioned 1760s and 1770s. Meanwhile, spokesmen for the so-called patriotic movement charged, shades of the Spanish arbitristas, that the once great Dutch Republic had become a society split between rentiers and beggars, the two groups least useful. Even the principal latter-day historians of the Netherlands, those writing in English like Jonathan Israel, Simon Schama, and C.R. Boxer, along with many Dutch, have echoed these pejoratives. Schama, in his The Embarrassment of Riches, noted that historians have found it possible to speak of an aristocratization of the Republic around this time. Certainly by 1730, the culture which had once transected social divisions had split into subcultures which corresponded to them. Even by the 1740s, writers in the spectatorial press were equating cosmopolitanism with excessive remoteness from the brede middenstand, the middling sort, and both as a betrayal of national patrimony. Israel, in his comprehensive survey of the Dutch rise and fall, emphasized the financial preoccupation, the shift by the Dutch upper classes to the passive economics of holding bonds and securities. By 1742, those who remained active merchants and manufacturers were falling from the upper income echelons in Leiden, Haarlem, and other major towns. The typical mid-18th century family of the governing or regent class had 57% of its assets in States of Holland bonds, over 25% in shares, obligations, and foreign funds, and just 12% in land and houses. Isaac Pinto, a Dutch economic writer, had found it worrisome in 1771 that bonds, shares, and foreign funds were the linchpin of civic wealth and status, the principal pillar of the social system, a situation quite unlike that existing in other countries. A further symptom of the economic collapse, according to Israel, was the astounding increase in the transfer and depositing of Dutch capital abroad. Amsterdam banking houses with foreign connections plied a roaring business throughout the 18th century in exporting the capital the United Provinces had accumulated during the 17th century. Mid-18th century estimates credited the Dutch with owning about a quarter of Britain's public debt. Mid-18th century estimates credited the Dutch with owning about a quarter of Britain's public debt and roughly one-third of the shares of the Bank of England and the British East India Company. As a measure of Dutch financial power, even as late as 1766, an observer noted that if 10 or 12 businessmen of Amsterdam of the first rank meet for a banking, i.e. a credit operation, they can in a moment send circulating through Europe over 200 million florins in payer money, which is preferred to cash. There is no sovereign who could do as much. This while a growing part of the population was jobless. And let me just insert here why I question the individual liberty which comes out of the Enlightenment, and why I sympathize with monarchy, because we can see here that, oh, what a wonderful age. The monarchs are losing. The monarchs are being replaced by what? By merchants, because the merchants have more money. We live in that world today. The mass of Dutch overseas assets, about 80% of them in England, was so large that Dutch officials insisted that the sum of foreign earnings made up for the decline in other sectors of the national income. However, the unacceptable polarization of income and wealth involved in such a calculus drew reformers' ire, and in the words of Professor Charles Boxer, whether Dutch capital was invested at home or abroad, it was lent to bankers and to brokers of commercial bills, rather than in developing home industries or fostering Dutch shipping. Hasta luego, amigos.